Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Travel Vault webinar. My name is Christina Brazier, and I'm Operations Director of Travel Vault. And I'm joined today by Martin Alcock, Director of Travel Trade Consultancy, and Luke Petherbridge, Director of Public Affairs at ABTA. Today we'll be discussing how the travel industry is faring as we head into autumn and what the outlook is. And as usual, all attendees will be muted for a better sound quality, but we do welcome any questions on the Q&A function, so please feel free to submit those throughout the webinar. As usual, the webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel a little later. We will also circulate it on our newsletter next week. So Martin and Luke, thank you both for joining me this afternoon.
No problem. Afternoon, everyone.
Afternoon, everybody.
Martin, if we can start with you, obviously yesterday was a key renewal date for many ATOL and ABTA members. Unfortunately, we've been experiencing our own difficulties and delays within Travel Vault as a result of the unprecedented impact on the industry. But how did the renewal go for you and your clients?
Terrible. That's the short answer. It's still going on, to be honest. I mean, it should really have finished. I think what I'd quite like at the end of it is, like they do at the stock exchange or on the Great British Bake Off, where they ring a gong and say it's finished, and it kind of isn't. It's just, I think because of the situation at the moment, everything was compressed right to the end. I think the regulators are, in fairness, under a lot of pressure, and last conversation I had with them late last night, there was still a huge number of people who they hadn't got to. Some of them problem cases, others just, they're just the logistics challenge. But over the last week, we're saying this a lot at the moment, aren't we? It's unlike anything any of us have ever experienced. Every single case is just a real challenge to get it over the line. And so going all the way up to some of the biggest names on that list, really, the regulators are asking for, in some cases, bigger bonds and cash injections. No one's got any cash. There are no bonds available. The lucky ones out there, the lucky few who do have access to facilities, are running around like headless chickens trying to get letters of credit in place. Let's say if they've got some sort of banking credit facility, a letter of credit in place to support the insurers, so the insurers will write the bond. We had middle of last week, I think it was, or maybe even back end of last week, we had the only real insurer that was throwing any sort of capacity at this cut its limits in half. I don't think it's them. I think it's their reinsurance that sits behind it, but they just said simply won't do anything above 5 million, which, for some of those companies with a 10 million bond, find out a week before renewal that they've got to go and find another 5 million. And like I say, the lucky few who do have access to those kinds of resources have been able to do something to get over the line, but an awful lot still trying. And what we're seeing, certainly in any of the larger cases, a bit like what we saw in April actually, is that the CAA in the ATOL side of things has given 12-month licenses. So for the outside world, you'll see lots of people with licenses, but they've all been given very short leashes. In some cases, in fact, I had one with a condition that by November, so literally a month or two, they've got on the license really. The outside world, it looks like it's 12 months, but they can't make any sales after November unless they go back to the CAA with an updated forecast, an updated cash projection to prove that they're still a going concern. And I think that's a kind of flexible move that the CAA have introduced just to allow that kind of slight kicking the can down the road a little bit. But it's definitely not over yet. It's going to be a real challenge, I think.
And so do you think we will see a much longer list of non-renewed travel companies this year? Or do you think, as you say, there have been kind of flexibility behind the scenes, which allows license to be renewed, but with a lot more stringent terms?
I think both. I think you'll see, we've been talking on these webinars about the cliff edge. And like I say, it was, and I don't mean this in any sort of ghoulish kind of way, but it's a bit of an anticlimax in that nothing has really happened. And when we were talking about it earlier, it feels a little bit like, Wile E. Coyote's run off the cliff edge and he's sort of running in the air, and he hasn't quite dropped yet. But it feels like there will definitely be failures that happen as a result of this. There will be others that, for some of those behind the scenes kind of mechanisms, will carry on and will keep going and soldiering on. But I know we're going to get on to talk about the sort of miserable, desperate backdrop to all of this, but it's getting worse. If anything, it's not getting better. So it's been a real challenge for everyone in the sector. You mentioned, I know Travel Vault members have had their problems, but this is across the whole sector. Like I say, from the biggest to the smallest. I just had 10 minutes before we came on here, an offer letter that came through, and it's the first they've ever mentioned it in this particular case. They've said we have to sign a trust account, a trust deed to roll into place if certain conditions aren't met within the month. No one's got the cash to do that, so they'll sign it because at this point it's easier to sign it and have the fight in a month's time. But yeah, it's awful.
It's incredibly difficult, and as you say, it used to be that you had the September the 30th renewal date and everything was done and dusted, but I think it's gonna drag on a lot longer for many of us. You mentioned about the cliff edge there, and obviously we've talked about that on previous webinars quite a lot. And the renewal was one issue for the cliff edge, but the other issue is obviously the end of the furlough scheme. A new job support scheme has obviously been introduced. Can you give us some details on that? We haven't really covered it on previous webinars. Can you give us a bit of a detail on that and whether you think that will make a difference to travel businesses?
Yeah, look, happy to give you my thoughts. It obviously isn't fully set up, and I haven't seen anyone actually go through this, so I'm only reading the guidance notes that are out there. I mean, from what I can see, it almost seems deliberately designed to do the opposite of what they're trying to achieve. I mean, just looking at some of the government's own worked examples on the website, the way it works is that the employer has to pay for the first third of the employee must work for at least a third of the time and must be paid by the employer for the first third, and then the remaining 2/3 of the employee's salary is kind of split between the government. So effectively the government makes a contribution, but I'm not even going to try and explain it now because it is complicated, and I'm sure you can send around the link to the government's analysis where it does work through a couple of examples. But where you end up, and the example that the government uses, somebody who drops down to say 2 days a week, so that's 40% of they're doing 40% of their usual hours. The way the employer has to, or the amount the employer has to pay and then knock off the government subsidy means you end up paying something like 60% of the salary cost for 40% of the work. And, this is obviously being designed to support. It's not, the government has been very clear, it's not a replacement of furlough, it's not an extension of furlough rather. But if you just work that through, if you had 2 employees and you would like to be able to keep them both, but by dropping them down to 40% of their hours, you end up paying even more for more than one full-time person. It just feels like it would be way more efficient, to be brutal about it, to lay one off and keep one on full-time. And that's the only way I see that playing out in any normal circumstance. And that's across the wider economy, right? That's all industries. You then factor in the problem we've had in travel since day one, actually, and this has been the problem of the main furlough scheme, is that it's not like a restaurant where it's closed and no one's coming in, so you don't need staff. These guys are busier than they've ever been, and they're having to work hard to fulfill refunds and look after customers. So it just seems unworkable to me. And there's all sorts of examples you can work through, but ultimately it looks like it almost incentivizes you to reduce your workforce but keep as many people as you can on full time rather than this idea of job sharing or reducing the numbers.
Yeah. And we'll come on to discuss that in a little bit more detail later. Particularly, obviously, it'd be good to get Luke's thoughts on that. But before we do so, obviously, it looks like that cliff edge is still there, very much so. But do you have any good news at all that we can share?
Well, look, all of the good news. I think the starting point is, and we've said this before, this is travel, and everybody I speak to, I'm sure the same as everyone listening, people are desperate to travel, and when they can travel again, they will. It's all anybody's talking about is the next trip they're going to take, and when they can get back to do what they love. So it's not a defunct product. This is a very, very valuable product that people will buy when they can, and it's a question of when and not if. So you start from that position. I feel quite positive actually about at some point in the future, and honestly, who knows whether that's 2 months, 6 months, 12 months, but at some point in the future, there will be lots of opportunities for reinventing the product. I mean, I'm reading so much about the long-term kind of consumer change that's going to be brought about by all of this. And actually, small businesses have always been far more nimble and far more able to adapt to those consumer changes. You know, just one as a for instance, you know, this idea of people wanting to work more time away from the office and working maybe only 2 days in the office and 3 days away. And I think there are already Travel Vault members who are able to structure product which is all about maximizing free time. And, you know, if you take this holiday, this is how many days you need out of the office. I'm thinking of a member in particular who articulates all of its kind of sales and marketing along those terms, maximize your free time. And there's a real opportunity, it would seem there to me, to build a product that suits those people who are going to work 3 days away from the office, but that doesn't necessarily have to be home. And so if you can factor in a product mix where they can work somewhere else and build in the sort of adventure holiday around that. So I think there's all sorts of examples. I think there will be lots and lots of consolidation and M&A opportunities. So either if you're in the market to buy something and pick up, or to sell the business, if you're still standing, it's self-selecting, you're a good and well-run business if you're still standing at the end of all of this. So there will be opportunities. It's just a question of survival. You know, you've got to survive until that upturn comes.
Yeah, that's definitely been the feeling I think that we've had over the last few months, and I'm sure it will continue. Luke, if I can bring you in at this point, many in the industry feel that the government isn't necessarily listening to them. I know obviously you've been active with your colleagues at ABTA. Can you outline some of the work that ABTA has been doing to help make government aware, particularly of the issues facing the travel industry?
Yeah. I mean, it's been a probably a uniquely busy period for sort of government relations, really. So you have to bear with me a bit. It's probably be quite a long answer, but I think there's been broadly sort of 3 phases to the pandemic. There was the initial sort of refunds crisis, the restart of travel that sort of happened in about July time, and then kind of a turn to recovery and financial support, particularly as that restart faltered with the changes to travel advice and quarantine policy and everything else that we saw. And we've been proactive throughout all of that. I mean, looking right back at the very beginning of this, you know, middle of March, right at the start of the crisis, we were one of the earliest associations, not just in travel, but actually in the wider economy, that was out there calling for salary support and rapid access to loans and financial measures, rates relief, grants for agents, whatever else we may have been calling for at the time, as well as working pretty relentlessly, I have to say, with ministers and members to demonstrate the depth of the cash crisis that the industry was going to find ourselves in. Of course, you know, I'm not pretending for a second that the furlough scheme or C-bills or the loan schemes were in place just because ABTA was calling for them, but we do have to recognise we were one of the early movers in that space, and equally the industry has benefited immensely from those regimes. Furlough, I think it's about 90% of the industry that are actually accessing the furlough regime at one point or another. We've seen an increasing uptake in loans, particularly as they announced the bounce back loans that were more accessible to smaller businesses. And in addition to that, right at the beginning of the crisis, from my team's point of view, we're also setting up Save Future Travel, which was our early sort of public-facing or parliament-facing campaign to raise awareness of what was happening amongst policymakers and the plight of the industry and the potential for job losses in travel. That campaign saw 26,000 emails sent to MPs, all but 2 members of Parliament received correspondence on that. And I think what has been notable throughout the crisis is, you know, this was a huge consumer challenge for the industry, the like of which we've never seen before. But we haven't really seen Parliament Parliament giving travel much of a kicking. We've certainly seen them giving the airlines a kicking, not least of all because of some of the employment practices, but also over refunds. You know, just yesterday there was a debate in the House of Lords on refunds, for example, where the airline industry did get a kicking, and actually the minister herself said if you're going to travel in the coming months during this pandemic, you should be looking for ABTA and ATOL protection. So clearly those messages have landed, and that has helped the industry to stave off some of the criticisms that we might otherwise have faced. I think that campaign also saw, of course, the CAA move on refund credit notes far too slowly, but we did eventually get them to acknowledge that those do retain ATOL protection. I think that's been hugely valuable to the industry in terms of, again, differentiating us from the airlines, frankly. You know, the lack of airline insolvency protection and the fact that we were able to offer a reassurance message to consumers, which helped many to rebook as opposed to just cancelling if we weren't able to do that, I think was very useful. In addition, I said about restart, ABTA was lobbying behind the scenes very heavily with FCDO, as they now are, of course, Foreign Office at the time, around moving away from the blanket travel advisory to regionalised approach. We've seen recently they've adopted the islands policy, so they're going to treat islands separately from mainlands. That could be very, very useful for the Canaries in the winter, depending on the general prevalence of the disease in Spain and in those areas, of course, but potentially very good news. We need to see that go further. Germany, Holland, various countries are doing fully regionalised quarantine policy. I see no reason why we can't do that. We also need to see the adoption of testing as an additional mitigation measure, of course. In addition to that, we've been continuing the fight for other business support measures for the replacement of furlough or ongoing salary support beyond the end of October. Just last week, as Martin was alluding to, the Winter Economy Plan, the government has moved away from their position previously of saying at the end of October, all support's going to be withdrawn and you're on your own. They clearly haven't gone far enough. Martin touched upon some of the reasons for that. I mean, the idea that you'd be paying a minimum of sort of 55% of salary for a third of the hours worked clearly isn't going to work in an industry that's, you know, at very most at 20% of revenue is probably not even there for the majority of businesses. But that's kind of where we were at when we did our member survey back in August. So clearly there are challenges, but, you know, the fact they've moved away from the previous position of just saying there will be no further support is welcome, and we need to now try and build on that. And hopefully you have seen today that we've kind of launched the next phase of the Save Future Travel Coalition and the campaign, and we're trying to engage the industry to say, actually tell your stories to your MP. That is going to be what gets ministers to move. It's going to be the personal stories, the human stories of what's happening in individual constituencies, and MPs going to the Chancellor and going to the Prime Minister and saying, actually, you know, we've got a problem here. This is an industry that is viable in the long term. You know, addressing what the Chancellor said last week, we know, as Martin said, people want to travel. There is nothing unviable about the travel industry, and actually in the long term, the economic recovery of the UK is dependent on the travel industry largely. You know, we support trading routes, we support the UK's international connectivity. What we need is to get travel businesses through the next 6 months, and that's going to be where our focus will be now with government over the coming weeks. But yeah, it's been a very busy period over the last 6 months. So hopefully that's a bit of a snapshot. I'm sure we'll come on to some of the areas in a bit more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. I mean, you must be very frustrated by the lack of action in some areas. And I know, obviously, your chief executive, Mark Tanzer, was quoted yesterday saying that the government measures are basically a straitjacket on the travel industry. I mean, why do you think the government has failed to provide specific support to the travel industry? And unlike obviously hospitality, we have the Eat Out to help out, and the arts, I believe, has just got additional funding. So I think it's very frustrating for the industry when there's nothing specifically aimed at the travel industry. Yeah,
I mean, look, we have to recognise there are two kind of key challenges that we face in government. The first is the traditional kind of view of travel as not being a strategic sector for the UK. As I think I touched upon in the last answer, that's just plain wrong, and that's the message we'll be given to government. You know, the aviation sector is seen as a strategic sector, but if it doesn't have its passengers, then clearly that isn't going to work. So it's addressing that. It's also addressing the challenge that, to be completely honest, we're also seen as an industry that has relatively low barriers to entry. You know, so the government does have this view that if travel companies fail, then new travel companies will emerge and jobs will be replenished as the economy recovers, and we are focused on addressing both of those points, not just as ABTA, but with the coalition that I mentioned earlier with government. I do think the other thing to recognise, though, is that, as I touched upon, there has been a lot of support that we have been able to tap into, and that actually we're not in a unique position as travel. You know, there's probably less than 10 sectors of the economy that have specific regimes. I mean, it's probably even 5, to be honest. There are hundreds of sectors of hundreds of businesses out there, multiple sectors of the economy that have exactly the same narrative as we have, which is that they don't have tailored specific support right now. So we absolutely aren't giving up on that. We want that tailored support, but I do think it's important that travel doesn't adopt this kind of view that we're the only ones that aren't having that support. Yeah. I mean, actually think about car manufacturing, various other parts of the economy aren't getting that support.
Okay, thank you. And obviously you talked about how your campaign has adapted over the last few months. So you said you've relaunched it today. What specifically are you focusing on at the moment?
Yeah, so I think we've evolved as time has moved on. I think it's gone on far longer than anyone sort of thought, to be honest, and certainly anyone would have hoped. What we've tried to do is build alliances so that large sections of the travel industry and the wider travel industry are speaking with kind of common asks and common messages to government. So the reason for the kind of relaunch today is that we now have the coalition that we formed together about 3 weeks ago with all of the main trade bodies and consortia within the travel industry. We've come together behind the 5 common asks, the regional quarantine, the introduction of testing, the APD holiday, which is an incentive to travel along the lines of Meet Up to help out, the ongoing financial support, and of course we do need the government to review the job support scheme. So those are the kind of 5 key messages we're giving, but in addition to the Safe Future Travel campaign work, we're also part of the Future Aviation Group, which is a backbench group of MPs. There's about 100 MPs from across all of the different parliamentary parties in that body, many of them Tories, and we are using that, working with the airline group and the airlines trade bodies and the aviation airport sector trade bodies to also ensure that we are amplifying each other's messages. I think that will be the focus over the coming weeks. And in terms of the policy areas, I think actually increasingly we will be focused on testing and on the regionalisation of the quarantine policy back to a fully regionalised approach, because that is critical to get the industry restarted and to boost the recovery. And clearly, if travel is to be able to use any of the schemes that have been announced over the recent weeks, then that needs to be our immediate focus, getting the government away from the measures that have dampened consumer confidence and completely destroyed the market, frankly, over the summer.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's good to hear actually that the airports and the airlines are involved as well. Obviously, Chief Executive at Heathrow has been very vocal about testing at airports. So it's good to hear that those they're all aligned with the messaging. In terms of our members and if they want to get involved, you talked about writing to MPs. Is that the key action that our members and other travel companies should be doing at the moment then in order to try and get some action?
Yeah, right now I think that is exactly what we need. We need personal stories going to members of parliament so they understand that this affects them and their constituencies and that they are speaking on our behalf. We've got 2 template texts available, one for operators, one for agents, essentially, abta.com/save future travel. And you can get to those. You can also get to it through the campaign website, savefuturetravel.co.uk. So yeah, I would absolutely urge everyone watching to engage with those.
Okay, thank you. And over the last few weeks, we've been holding webinars, and Martin's joined us on quite a few of those as well. And one of the key issues that comes up is airlines and the disparity, I think, between tour operator responsibilities and airlines. And we've actually, just had a question that kind of outlines one of the issues there, which is, that airlines are cancelling, not necessarily refunding, and yet tour operators got that responsibility. How have you been managing that and advising your members at ABTA on that?
Yeah, well, we've been working with the CAA, who are obviously the regulatory body for airlines throughout. We've been reporting all cases that are given to us to the CAA and urging them to take action against the airlines. I think they acknowledged that the enforcement powers they have, frankly, aren't good enough right now. I do think that is an area of regulatory change that is likely to be an increasing debate over the next 6 months or so. The government was already committed to an airline insolvency bill this year in the Queen's speech in December. They've now said they're going to consult widely on that with the entire sector. We welcome that because actually, if you look at Queen's speech, the notes that were published alongside it, it was a very narrow scheme they had in mind. And I think the last 6 months has shown why that can't be the approach, frankly, that the government takes. So I would encourage everyone to engage with that. I think that will be an important thing for the industry to change this in future. Right now, we have to accept that all we can do is report these cases through to the CAA and to hope that the enforcement bodies will take action to get the airlines paying.
Okay, that's interesting because I don't think that's something that we've necessarily told our members before, but if there are specific airlines that are proving difficult, then it is best to report them to the CAA to get action against them, or at least get them emailing them.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, if they're IATA agents, that's a route as well. We've been working with IATA to demonstrate where their members haven't been refunding in line with their BSP policy. And we'll continue to make that case as well.
Okay, thank you. And Martin, obviously you've got lots of clients who've been impacted, by airlines and by the government restrictions. What do you think the feeling out there is in terms of whether government will actually change anything over the next few weeks or months?
Yeah, well, look, I'm certainly not hopeful of that. I think it feels like it's, despite all of the calls and all of the efforts, I do think I take quite a cynical view in that the government priority has been around domestic spending and making sure that whether it be getting restaurants and bars open or getting British high streets open, that's taken the priority. And I think if you look at the big picture of managing cases and infection rates, it's all a trade-off, isn't it? If you want to open schools, you have to accept that maybe the pubs have to close at 10. That's the sort of modelling that they're doing. And I think when you've got outbound travel in there, and it's quite possibly a contributor to caseloads, it's a sort of easy one to knock off when that's spending going on overseas. So that's what it feels like to me. And I think one sort of element of positivity, actually, if you do look at the government stats, and their main publication is every quarter, but they are issuing sort of flash reports each month. And the August spending figures just came out a day or two ago, and actually they're very positive. I mean, they're saying consumers are spending more than pre-lockdown. They're back to February sorts of levels. The issue is they're obviously spending on home furnishings and those sorts of things. So they're not spending on what we won't want them to spend. The other interesting dynamic, and again goes back to what I said at the start about long-term trends, is you've seen a massive leap in online spending as part of this whole thing. Now, partly that will unwind because there was a period where high streets were closed and it wasn't possible to spend in a high street, and so it jumped and has come back. But it feels like you've seen about a 4-year shift in one big step of people spending online. So there are elements. I mean, it's a bit of an axiom in travel, isn't it, that spending on travel and outbound travel sort of follows the economic cycle, and so that economic recovery is obviously vital. But for as long as there's this uncertainty and this on-off lockdown and this quite sort of strange approach to countries being sort of suddenly struck off the list, that breeds uncertainty, and it just means people will leave it later and later to commit, I suppose.
And in terms of your client, obviously, lots of people are focused on the immediate issues, but over the last 12 months, going back even to Thomas Cook and then coronavirus, it's outlined a number of issues like within the regulations and FCDO advice, all that sort of stuff. Are your clients hoping for reform going forward, and what would be their kind of key wants in that reform? Well,
I think there's an obvious disconnect, isn't there? I mean, Luke's just touched on it, between tour operators and airlines. And I think the question that David's asked, and maybe we'll just touch on that specifically, because I think that does play to this, doesn't it? It's this idea that there's a sort of sensible time frame that you have to look and cancel flights. That's certainly, you can look here and say realistically nobody's going to be flying to Costa Rica in December or November, but for as long as there's a glimmer of hope, I believe is the sort of guidance. So as long as there's a glimmer of hope of that happening, there's no obligation on the airline to cancel that and incur the costs, which sort of strings everybody along, and it's just deeply unhelpful from a reputation and a customer management point of view. What I would say, and this particular question is about BA, and we have had examples of them being more proactive or being more kind of flexible, I suppose. So certainly allowing customers to change, even outside of this, their most recent guarantee. We have seen them offering alternative dates and those sorts of things. Whether that goes as far as cancellation and refund when they haven't officially cancelled a flight, I'm not so sure. And I think that would probably come down to your kind of commercial relationship with them. But you just go back to that sort of whole, are the current regs fit for purpose? I mean, this whole FCDO trigger thing, which has been, the debate's been raging, right? And a couple of big high-profile OTAs have left ABTA as a result. We talked about that quite a bit, and I do think we've got to be really careful about what we wish for, because what might work in this current situation, the ask of those OTAs is scrap the Foreign Office advice. We should all be able to decide whether it's unavoidable and extraordinary circumstances, and we'll decide. Well, if you play that through, and we did have an example of this a few years ago when there was a terrorist attack in Nice, and you have somebody going to Paris, and they go, oh, there's terrorism in France, I want to cancel and have a refund. Well, for as long as you can say, well, the Foreign Office hasn't said it, so sorry, you can't have a refund. It's very clear to everybody. You open the door, then you're going to have to field all of these sorts of, well, that's in the vicinity and you have to make a decision. It's going to add an enormous amount of cost. It's going to open the door to lots more court cases and challenges. And I think ultimately will end up being more detrimental than the current situation, which is clearly unhelpful, the current Foreign Office sort of blanket ban. But I fear the alternative could be worse.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. Clearly, you know, the ABTA board position, which is that you have to give the option to refund in the event that there is the FCO advice against all but essential travel. That doesn't mean that you have to refund. Of course, if a traveller wants to travel and you're comfortable with your liability position in sending that person there, although there's some important considerations in that before you do that, of course. But I completely agree with what Martin was saying. You know, I think as an industry, we really need to think about the longer term consequences of trying to take on that determination ourselves. You know, at the moment, the FCDO, yes, you know, there's some concern about how they're handling the COVID-19 crisis, but they are an independent body. They do have the intelligence and knowledge of the state behind them. I think the idea that the travel industry somehow is better placed to make that decision going forward is vulnerable territory for us to get into. And, you know, at a time when we will be looking to rebuild customer confidence, I'm really not sure that it would be a smart move for the industry to suddenly take that on, to be honest.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Thank you. And I think, you know, it's very, very easy for people to say what they want now, but I guess, you know, we do have to remember that this has been a completely unprecedented period. So as you say, it's worth, you know, thinking very carefully about implications. Obviously, we've all been quite focused on coronavirus over the last few months, but dare I say it, Brexit also looms closer. And for those of us, including myself, who have lost track, Luke, you're pretty up on these things. Can you tell us like what the current position is on Brexit, and you know what impact are we expecting on 1st of January, or is it still all up in the air?
Well, a lot of it is, to be honest. I think if you're asking for the kind of political will we do a deal, nobody truly knows the answer to that question. My own feeling on that is that there is a clear kind of message coming out of Downing Street. They still want to do that deal, despite the UK Internal Market Bill and the row that we've been having about breaking international law and all of that. And there is a route through that. If you think about the timeline with the laws looking at that legislation, they won't deal with that until probably the middle of November. By then, we could have a trade deal, so they could remove the offending provisions at the end of that process, and we could all pretend that row sort of never happened. I'm aware I say that on the day, though, that of course that the EU has launched legal action against the UK. So who knows whether that will be where we end up, but you could see a route to that being the case. In terms of what it means for travel, I think actually the key kind of takeaway of what the government has done over last year, even since we signed the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration that went alongside it, but obviously wasn't politically binding, has been that we're not seeking the kind of level of relationship that we previously had understood that we might, certainly not from Theresa May's days of sort of deep and special partnership, but not even from where we were in October last year. The political declaration spoke about ongoing cooperation about on things like state aid, on things like level playing field conditions, all of that the UK government is making pretty clear now it has no interest in doing that going forward. So I think whatever happens, we are looking at a bare bones deal. That will mean that there will be some disruption. It's about managing that as best we can, and clearly a deal means that we can manage that better than ending up without a trade deal at the end of this year. You know, just thinking about things like aviation and access and all of that, you know, even with a bare bones deal, there will be changes, but point-to-point traffic will probably be largely okay. That's probably true across most of the transport modes. Coach travel is a slightly different one there, because third country coach access isn't something covered under the EU Interbus agreement, which will probably exceed to. So it is now, how do we manage disruption, as opposed to, you know, can we come up with a deal that means there is none? I think the big concern for us is employment, actually, at the moment. So we know with the scope of the deal the government is now trying to strike with the European Union, there won't be a replacement for the Posted Workers Directive. That will have impacts for businesses going forward. So for this year, we've recommended to our businesses in ABTA's guidance that we provide for members that they look at local contracts, so hiring locally in each destination where they operate. That will give the people who are working for those companies the rights of the withdrawal agreement. So if there is no trade deal, you'll be able to stay under the withdrawal agreement until the end of your contract. But longer term, once we're through the winter season, how we hire people into next summer is a really difficult question to answer now that we know the Posted Workers Directive won't be replaced. We're looking at a deal based on General Agreement in Trade and Services. There's some real problems with that. I mean, length of stay, maximum length of stay under those agreements is 90 days. So you're then essentially relying on each member state to turn a blind eye or come up with national rules that enable them to ignore those rules. So that's the real big known unknown, if we like, but concern, I think, for the industry.
And are you advising your members to prepare for that at the moment, or is it too much of a known unknown to kind of take any action?
Yeah, well, on the employment piece, we can say that, for as I said, the year coming up, the winter season coming up, which clearly we hope that there will be a winter season. With COVID, that's not a guarantee, but that local hires are the way to manage that risk for the coming winter season. Beyond that, it is more difficult to give that advice yet. We do need to wait and see what the deal on employment flexibility is, and what options that leaves available to our members. And then actually across the wider scope, there's a new communications campaign that's just started from the FCO, and on a number of those areas, they are quite clear that the final answer just isn't known at this point. So pet passports is the best one, isn't it? Because you need 4 months to prepare to take your pet overseas, potentially, depending on where we're listed, and we're less than 4 months from the end of the year. And the answer in that advice that the government has just launched is we don't know.
And Martin, obviously, is this featuring in your conversations with your clients at the moment, or is it people are just too busy dealing with COVID-19?
Yeah, not at all. It literally hasn't come up once in this renewal, and it's really surprising because actually, if you think of after the 2018 changes to the regulations and that whole place of establishment piece, as a UK business, you can currently use your ATOL to sell holidays to anywhere in Europe, and that is a cliff edge. That ends at the end of the year. And so if it is, and I don't know if that's a big part of the Travel Vault membership, but certainly in the wider UK tour operator market, there are a lot of people doing that and selling quite large proportions of their program into other countries, and they just won't be able to do that legally. They'll need to license well, either license in every territory if they're selling as a third country, or more sensibly, if there are lots of countries, go and establish in one EU territory and then sort of use their passporting rights from there. There was a bit of activity on that, I guess, in the run up to the last big sort of cliff edge of no deal Brexit back in 2019, and a few companies did take steps to incorporate subsidiaries in, say, the Netherlands or in Ireland to do that. But it's totally silent, and actually the regulators never asked either, so people were still filling in application forms that said X% of their business would be sold to the EU, and it still sat on their ATOL, but there needs a solution. Now, maybe it's just because everybody's got bigger things to worry about. Maybe no one's too concerned with the ability to sell holidays in Europe in January, just because they might not be selling any holidays anywhere in January. But it feels a little bit like we're sleepwalking towards it again, I would say. And that's fair, that's for very obvious reasons, because I think, quite honestly, if you're worried about whether you're going to survive beyond the end of this month or this quarter, then what happens much further down the line is less of a concern, isn't it?
Yeah, well, obviously there's a lot of movement at the moment on Brexit, and it's something that we will cover on a future webinar, definitely, particularly when there's more clarity. Luke, I've got a couple of questions from our attendees, if that's okay. So one of our members has asked, well, they've basically stated they've been writing to their MP since March, obviously pressing for specific support, which is one of the things that you've been saying should be done. He says, if, as you say, the overall economic recovery is reliant on travel's recovery, how, as such a contributor to the UK economy, but despite obviously your best efforts, the industry has non-existing lobbying power? And I think this has been something across many years, actually, that people feel that there just isn't enough lobbying and power by the travel industry. I mean, what's your view on that, and what can we do to change it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily agree with the premise that we have non-existing lobbying power. I think, as I touched upon in my opening remarks, you know, there's been a lot that the government has done that we were calling for and that has helped travel businesses, whether that be furlough the loan schemes, the bounce back loan schemes, you know, even in the last week, we've seen the extension of the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act, which is hugely helpful to a number of travel companies that otherwise might be facing, frankly, litigation to try and wind their businesses up because they hadn't refunded customers. So I think there has been, you know, measures made available that are beneficial to travel. Having said that, you know, as I said earlier, we can't get away from the point, and Martin raised it himself as well, that there is this overriding focus right now on spending in the UK and those sort of symbolic local businesses that are in each constituency, and that is a challenge we face. I appreciate that people have been speaking to MPs since March. I think the reason for the renewed call is that we have the winter economy plan, we have the job support scheme, we have a very clear objective, which has to be to try and change that scheme. Frankly, you know, if we want to try and save travel businesses, now's the time to try and do that. And I think highlighting the practical reality of why that scheme doesn't work for you is really important. And actually, most MPs don't understand how travel works. Most MPs certainly won't know how a travel agency works or how you get your money, the fact you're paid on commission on the departure of your customer, the fact you haven't received money for 12 months or won't have done by the time we get around to next March. Those sorts of details are really important, and we do need to be explaining those probably now more so than ever, because, you know, they're more relevant to the job support scheme than they were to the furlough scheme.
Yeah.
And that would be the reason I would ask people to engage right now.
Okay, thank you. And had another question. Has there been any indication from the government of when travel may open up further? Are there any rumours behind the scenes about early 2021?
Nothing specific. Obviously, we're sat here on a Thursday, so today is the day when we'll probably find out the latest changes. We don't know specifically what destinations will be coming on or off. I think longer term, what we really need to see is, as I touched upon earlier, is a shift back from the FCDO to a more standard kind of approach to how they treat travelling. So we need them to get away from blanket advice not to travel with exemptions to places you can, back to a general assumption you can travel and advice within those destinations that is regionalised, that deals with where maybe there are higher rates of infection. We've seen a little bit of a shift towards that, as I said, with the islands policy that was adopted last month, but we need that to go much, much further. And in time, we also need them to separate clearly the DfT's quarantine policy from FCDO travel advice and move back to the kind of normal approach to that latter policy.
Thank
Chris,
you.
Chris, I'd just throw in there as well, not really government related, but if you look at what the airlines are putting out themselves and the guidance that they're giving, unfortunately it is going backwards again. But I mean, Ryanair were out talking about December traffic being around 10% of what it would normally be. Most of the airlines are sort of coalescing around this between 30 and 50% capacity being put back on for around the start of next year. So I think even that maybe looks a bit optimistic at this point, I would say. But if you go back a few weeks of what they were saying, a few weeks ago, they were expecting that by December they'd be up at the 50, 60, 70% sort of mark, and they've had to chop that right back. So I think there's very much an expectation that it's continuing. It sort of feels like that last announcement, which wasn't quite going back into lockdown, but it felt almost as weighty and as disappointing and depressing as the very first lockdown announcement, I felt. And straight away you saw the stockpiling of bog rolls and all that sort of stuff kicking off again. It sort of felt like with that announcement of these measures could be in place for 6 months, it was like a real knock to the optimism, I think, and certainly businesses have reacted to that.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, and that's certainly the feedback we're getting from our members as well. Luke, I've got a question, and I believe this is Brexit. I'm hoping you can answer it. So the 90-day in 180-day rule seems to be open to interpretation by individual countries. Do you understand it to be a total of 90 days within any 180-day period, or a strict 90 days starting on the first day of arrival in Europe?
No, so it is 90 days within any 180-day period, but of course for staff, that means essentially you can have them there for 3 months. Now, they are right that Robert's right that it is open to interpretation by each member state. We would hope that particularly the summer destinations would take a lenient view on this. They understand the value of travel to to their countries from the UK. We've been talking to them for, 4 years now since the referendum. They've always been giving us a fairly positive steer that they will find a way through this. And actually, think back to last year, countries like Spain had adopted unilateral legislation that said we could continue to send staff into their country as we do now, pretty much. But that's not going to be the case across the board, and particularly for the winter ski season market, France, they don't tend to take very sympathetic views of legislation around employment and around skills. They never have. We've obviously, as an industry, had our battles with the French around things like ski guiding down the years, and I think that's going to be the real challenge. Is some countries will absolutely take an accommodating position, some probably less so. And we were hoping the government would put in place a pan-European regime that would protect us going forward, and then they haven't done that.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's all the questions I've got for now. I just want to say thank you both for your time this afternoon. I was hoping to end on a positive, and I'm really grateful to one of the attendees who's giving me that opportunity. He has said, Matthew has said, we've had a big jump in bookings in September for 2021 and 2022. So it's something to look forward to. And thank you for sharing that bit of positive news for us all. And, you know, I do hope that for everybody, even if right now in terms of last minute bookings or the winter season is not looking good, that going forward things will improve. And I think, as you've said all the way along, Martin, there is a lot of pent up demand for people going on holiday. I know everyone I speak to is definitely looking forward to their next trip. So thank you both. It's been a really interesting discussion, and no doubt we'll continue to cover these matters over the coming months and weeks. Thank you also to all the attendees for watching or listening. We'll be holding another webinar later this month, and details will be circulated early next week. In the meantime, thank you for joining us and have a great afternoon.